Good morning. I hope everybody got their energy out with the break. We're going to come back together and continue our conversation about child development and authenticity. But in this session, we're going to focus on the lens of gender and gender expectations.
Sorry. We're getting a little riley.
Just establishing my male dominance.
Yes, very good. I'm glad you did that.
And so we've had a really good setting of the stage. One of the things we know is that children from birth are bombarded with messages about how they're expected to behave in our society. They get messages that are direct and indirect, and many of those messages have to do with what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. What behavior is appropriate for a boy versus a girl? What feelings are appropriate for a boy versus a girl? What attitudes are important? What jobs are expected? How are you supposed to look, right? My daughter and I have she has a son, I have a grandson who's 4 and is a boy, strong, vibrant little boy with long, beautiful curls. Okay. Elevator conversation last weekend was my trying to explain to a woman in the elevator that no, he was a boy. So it's, I don't know what he's processing and thinking through that. So we're going to talk with 3 panelists who come from they do their work in different arenas, and I think it's going to be really interesting to hear the information that comes together and the ideas that come across. We have Josh Aronson, who is an associate professor of applied psychology at New York University. Catherine Ashcraft, who's a senior research scientist with the National Council for Women in Information Technology. And Carol Sutton Lewis, who is the founder of Ground Control Parenting, which is a website and blog for parents of children of color. And she also has the perspective of sitting on the boards of a number of educational organizations. So let's start. I'd like to hear from each of you about when you think about gender expectations and you think about gender socialization, what are the forces that you see at play in our society? So Josh, do you want to start? You're sitting right here on my right.
In a nutshell, well, thank you for having me to this. This is great. I want to say that I don't have a super pat answer to this question. I've watched kids as a researcher express stereotypical feelings, and it's really funny. Like at age 10, kids become sort of aware of the fact that you're not supposed to use stereotypes. And I look at children from all ages up, and there's something refreshingly honest about young children. They'll come up to you on the street and go, "Hey, you're black." And you can see the mother getting very uncomfortable and saying, "Don't say that." By 10 years old, they don't do that anymore. By 10 years old, they know that that's wrong. So regardless of gender in particular, I think that at a certain age, kids just learn that some things you don't say you're not supposed to be authentic about your observations. At the same time, 10-year-olds, as they realize the discomfort that is felt about gender, race, any kind of expression of stereotypes, they almost have an aha experience and go, uh-oh, people must be thinking but not saying those things about my social identity. And so you see at about age 10, kids getting vulnerable to the stereotypes that they realize are out there about their group. So we've studied kids exposing them to gender stereotypes, to racial stereotypes, and look at, for example, how it affects their standardized test performance. No real big effects before age 10, but at age 10, when kids start to realize that the world out there makes a distinction between appropriate and inappropriate things to think about other people, those stereotyped expectations start influencing what they say, how they feel when they think they might be evaluated, where gender or race is relevant, how they perform on tests, how they define themselves. And I think in terms of authenticity, you often see with women the inability to be themselves. And so if you interview women in math classes, for example, they'll say, well, I usually wear makeup to my classes, but not math class. So that, not that that's the worst thing in the world, but it's just a marker of how being who you normally are in some context is not acceptable. You should tone it down. Don't be yourself. Children more generally, I think, learn to not be themselves around age 10. And it's sort of a tragedy because you see them looking around to other people to see what's appropriate. I started doing research about 5 years ago on children in school doing mindfulness. And this is why I had that question. It is probably the most encouraging thing I've ever seen happen in a school, which is kids going inside, becoming quiet, and learning to really accept reality, to sit with reality, to sit with their imperfections and accept the imperfections of other people, to become authentic, and to watch children become authentic is such a treat. Because when they start accepting themselves and stop, I guess, just the word like biased processing about information, that becomes a general habit, and they become more authentic and accepting of other people. When you're used to seeing children tear each other apart and silence each other, it's quite a breath of fresh air. So some of the things we've done in schools is to, we'll get individual kids really excited about school, and they'll be so down with it. But then bring their friends in, and it'll be like that kid who was so enthusiastic before is now shut down. They can't have their authentic reaction in this context where, to think of a cute way of saying it, public displays of enthusiasm are incredibly discouraged, say in a high school. And so a lot of kids go through the day feeling like what they really feel inside is inappropriate. And I think there must be all kinds of consequences of that we haven't even begun to plumb. But I think that variable self-esteem would be a big one, where you cannot get clarity on your self-concept because there's people, or at least you think there's people ready to shut you down for expressing your true self. When we introduce mindfulness, we see an uptick in authenticity that makes me know that this is what I want to study for the rest of my days. I do want to say, I had made a few notes, that as somebody who studied educational psychology and who teaches people all the time, I think that the ideal relationship between a teacher and a student is one in which you can say, I love you, but that work sucks. I love you, but that needs work. And too often, I think the mistake is made by teachers is that they put the rigor before the relationships. And I've watched schools crash and burn trying to address the achievement gap by saying rigor before relationships. To be able to be authentic with a child who needs help with their work, you have to have a steady foundation, a stable foundation of trust within which you can say, I love you, but that really needs a lot of work. Otherwise, kids will turn against you and not see the constructive feedback for what it is. I have a lot more, but I know that I've gone over. And Catherine is going to hit me if I don't.
No, I won't at all. I confess, I had to think very carefully how to pack all of this into 5 minutes. So I also have a few notes here just to keep me on track and focused, but feel free to hit me. Already.
Get going.
So first, I think, especially when we talk about gender, it's important to say that we often think about boy, girl, male, female, but that already this is quite limited terminology, right? And that this kind of reinforces the gender binary and leaves out the experiences of transgender or other gender expressions. And so already the way we talk about it, right, is limiting and limits authenticity in very real ways. And then I think the other thing that's important to say is that we often, because we're talking about gender, we think of it maybe monolithically and not as much as how it intersects to the question back there earlier today about intersectionality and how gender intersects with other identities like race, class, ability, and so that there's multiple kinds of masculinities, femininities, and sexualities, and so the experiences that white women face are different than women of color. There's certainly some overlap, but also some differences. And of course, I'm not going to be able to do any of that justice in this 5 minutes, but just wanted to make that point that we think about that deeply when we talk about these issues in more depth. But today I just wanted to make 2 points, really, that I think are particularly important for authenticity and are particularly timely right now. And one of those is this idea of personality penalties. So in my work at NCWIT, National Center for Women in IT, we work with companies and educational organizations helping people identify biases in their everyday interactions. And so one of the things we've really been hitting hard these days, and you can also see it in the election as well, both my points, even more so than usual. So is this idea of personality penalties and this research that shows that both men and women are held to certain kinds of behavioral and personality kinds of norms, right? But a lot of research shows that women receive far more personality criticism in their day-to-day work and life and achievements than girls as well from the time that they're very young. So you can think of these as things like, being called bossy or being told to tone it down or being told that if you just, would step back and let other people